My golden brother flirted with my wife. I caught them and shattered their lives with one swift revenge. My name is Mark, I'm 28, and if there were a championship for living in the shadow of an older brother, I'd win gold, hands down. Leo, 30, my brother. The eternal golden boy. He wasn't just admired. He was practically canonized by everyone around us. Parents, friends, even neighbors who barely knew him held him up as this glowing beacon of perfection. Picture someone tall, confident, with a grin that could probably win elections, and a talent for making every conversation seem like the most important one you'd ever have. And the cherry on top? Women adored him. Leo had that magnetic charm, the kind that made people feel like they were in the presence of someone remarkable. Whenever he spoke, there was this collective pause, as if the world was holding its breath just to hear what he'd say next. When I was younger, I thought it was cool to have a brother like that. But now it felt like a shard of glass wedged deep in my soul, and every move I made just pushed it further in. Let me set the stage. I'm married to Sophie. She's not just my wife. She's my rock, my safe harbor, my best friend all rolled into one. She's the reason I push myself out of bed in the morning. The reason I keep trying to be better, despite knowing that better might never be enough to catch up to Leo. Sophie and I had something real, something unbreakable. Or so I thought. Lately, though, there's been a shift, subtle yet sharp, like a splinter you can't find, but keeps stabbing you every time you move. It started during those family gatherings that I'd learned to endure. Leo, with his easy laugh and stories that captivated a room, began paying a little too much attention to Sophie, and it wasn't just harmless jokes or light conversation. No, it was something more. Take last Sunday's dinner, for instance. We were talking about movies, the kind of casual chatter that fills the silence, and out of nowhere, Leo turns to Sophie and says, "Sophie, have you seen that movie? There's this girl in it with eyes just like yours. Absolutely mesmerizing." Eyes? Seriously, Leo? He locked eyes with her just a bit too long, and I felt my fist tighten under the table. My rational mind screamed that it was just a harmless comment, but the part of me that had been walking in his shadow for almost 3 decades flared with something much darker. But it didn't stop there. 5 minutes later, he had started another conversation, weaving Sophie into it as if she were the most interesting person at the table. He was slick about it too, steering the talk so naturally that everyone else barely noticed. They just thought, "Oh, they're chatting. No big deal." And there I was, a storm raging inside me, like biting into something spicier than you expected, and realizing too late that there's no water in sight. Sophie, for her part, answered politely, smiling as one does at family events, never giving away anything more than simple courtesy. But each time I watched their interaction, the unease deepened. It was a dawning realization, slow and suffocating. This wasn't just my paranoia. Something was off, and it had been for a while. Over time, Leo's behavior escalated to a point where, if my life were a movie, it would have transitioned straight into a psychological thriller. His compliments weren't just playful. They were intimate, the kind you'd whisper behind closed doors. One that still makes my blood simmer. "Sophie, you look absolutely stunning today, like a star from old Hollywood." "Oh, perfect, Leo. Enlighten us with your detailed knowledge of classic actresses, because clearly that's the most important takeaway during dinner with family." And he never missed an opportunity to maneuver himself beside her. It was like clockwork. I'd step away to take a call, come back from the kitchen, or simply arrive a few minutes late, and there he was, seated right next to Sophie, flashing that insincere, "Oh, I just happened to sit here," grin. The act was almost laughable. Almost. To me, it was a sick reminder of how everyone else was too blinded by his charisma to notice. To our parents, Leo was still their beloved son, who could do no wrong. Mom would even beam when he helped Sophie clear the table, conveniently ignoring my "I'll take care of it" protest. "Sure, Mom, let your golden boy play hero while I sit on the sidelines, biting my tongue so hard it might just bleed." Sophie, bless her heart, always looked caught in an awkward spotlight. She'd offer a polite, faint smile and try not to engage too much, probably just trying to keep things peaceful. But no matter how gracefully she navigated the situation, I couldn't help but feel every nod, every chuckle, every word exchanged as if they were blows aimed straight at my chest. Then there was that night, a dinner that felt more like a gauntlet. The air was relaxed. Everyone had a drink in hand, conversation flowing. Leo leaned forward, and with that trademark smirk, reached out to emphasize some joke he was making. And his hand? It touched Sophie's just briefly, but enough to set my nerves on fire. Inside, a voice roared, "You're 1 second away from losing it! Don't let this go any further!" But what were my options? Grab him by the collar and drag him out in front of everyone? In my head, it played out like a scene worthy of an Oscar. Dramatic, decisive. In reality, I sat there, muscles tense, jaw clenched, while Leo carried on with his little act of being the charismatic older brother who was just having some harmless fun. And everyone else? Blissfully unaware of the firestorm raging inside me. My unease grew like an unchecked weed, spreading roots so deep that I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Leo's behavior had shifted, evolving from playful quips and harmless jests to something sharper, something invasive. I started observing him with an intensity I hadn't known I possessed, tracking each look, each fleeting pause. He was no longer satisfied with casual compliments. He craved moments alone with Sophie, as if seeking some private connection I wasn't meant to witness. The moment that tipped my suspicions into certainty came one afternoon. His voice, effortlessly smooth, carried through the hall as he said, "Let's grab some coffee and chat." It sounded innocent enough, like an everyday suggestion between family. But to me, it landed like a threat wrapped in velvet, an attempt disguised as casual interest. Sophie, ever graceful, dismissed the invitation with a polite smile and moved on without a second thought. But that scene looped endlessly in my mind, an irritating refrain I couldn't mute. What kind of chat did he need when I wasn't around? I knew Leo's game too well. I'd grown up studying the way he effortlessly charmed his way into anything he wanted. Now, the notion of him seeking those private moments with my wife coiled in my stomach, a mix of cold dread and simmering fury. After that, there was no going back. I spent hours replaying scenarios in my head, each one angrier than the last, each one making me more certain that Leo was testing boundaries and watching for how far he could push. He was playing a bold game while I stood by, helplessly on the sidelines. That's when I knew hoping and waiting would do nothing. I had to take action. So, I did what any husband with fraying nerves would do. I set up a small camera in the living room. Tiny, discreet, hidden between a couple of books, positioned just right to capture anyone who might come in when I wasn't there. And I knew Leo well enough to know he'd eventually drop by with some excuse. Visiting the parents, returning a book, something mundane yet calculated. Was setting up the camera too much? Probably. But I wasn't in a place to trust, probably. Caution felt like the only thing standing between me and betrayal. The days that followed were filled with an uncomfortable mix of guilt and watchfulness. I questioned if I'd gone too far, if I was seeing problems that weren't really there. But there was one thing I couldn't deny. I wasn't willing to sit idly by and watch Leo try to weave himself into my life, not with Sophie at stake. Each day that passed, the camera sat waiting, a silent sentinel, ready for the moment when truth or paranoia would reveal itself. The day matched my mood perfectly. Heavy, unyielding, the kind of rain that drummed incessantly on the roof and windows like a cruel taunt. Normally that sound had a soothing effect on me, a rhythm that brought a sense of calm. But not today. Today, it was just noise, an ominous soundtrack to the moment that would sear itself into my mind forever. As I stepped into the house, I saw them, Leo and Sophie, seated in the living room. At first it looked innocent enough, just a conversation between two people. But beneath the surface, I felt the tension, an undercurrent that prickled at the back of my neck. It was as if someone had slowly turned the dial on a silent alarm. Leo leaned forward, the smirk on his face cutting deeper than any knife. He spoke with a kind of audacity only he could pull off. "You deserve better than Mark." The words were clean, direct, devastating. They struck me so hard that for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the rain's relentless pounding. Sophie's reaction was immediate. Her eyes went wide, and she sprang to her feet, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. She instinctively stepped back, trying to create distance, but Leo reached out and grabbed her arm before she could move further. And then there it was, a silence so profound it felt alive, vibrating with the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching the scene unfold as if I were a spectator in someone else's life. No dramatic entrance, no slammed doors or shouted accusations, just me, rooted to the spot while the rain pelted the windows, the only sound more intense than my heartbeat hammering in my chest. Leo turned his head, and for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar flash in his eyes. Surprise. Not fear, because Leo never feared anything, but genuine shock. He'd always believed his golden reputation was an impenetrable shield, that he could do and say whatever he wanted without consequence. But now he knew. This time things were different. Something inside me cracked, and it wasn't subtle. It was an eruption, a surge of anger and betrayal so fierce it obliterated any hesitation or doubt. I saw the moment he realized he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His confident smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, and I knew. He was aware that this time, he'd gone too far. This wasn't a conflict that words or half-hearted apologies could mend. It was the kind of rage that consumes, an unstoppable wildfire ready to devour everything in its path. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that this moment was the start of something irreversible. My reaction was swift, like a strike of lightning. I lunged forward and grabbed Leo by the shoulders, shoving him so hard he nearly stumbled into the coffee table cluttered with forgotten photo albums. Snapshots of happier times that no one cared to revisit now. "What do you think you're doing, Leo?" My voice came out raw, sharp as splintered glass. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, everything froze. Then Leo's mouth opened, spilling out words that only stoked the flames. "Mark, I couldn't hide my feelings anymore," he said, voice drenched in faux sincerity, like cheap cologne that clings too long. "I've always thought Sophie was special." Special? Was this really happening? Was he really going to stand there and spin out a cheap romantic confession like he was the tragic hero of a bad soap opera? The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. A dark, bitter laugh that caught in my throat instead. Sophie, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, stepped between us, voice trembling like a thin string ready to snap. "Please stop," she whispered, her words so soft they barely seemed to make it out into the air. And then came the interruption. The clatter of hurried footsteps, followed by the sight of our parents entering the room. Mom's face was ghost white, eyes wide and unblinking, like she'd stumbled into a nightmare. Dad stood at her side, mouth opening to speak, to ask what was going on or maybe just to demand silence, but I wasn't going to give him the chance. "You always turned a blind eye to his behavior," I said, my voice cutting through the air, meeting their eyes without wavering. "Every time, every single moment, you ignored his antics because he was your golden boy." The accusation hung there, exposed and raw, in the space between us. Leo stood there, face frozen in a mask of regret so forced it almost looked rehearsed, like he was ready to award me an Oscar for Best Dramatic Performance. That look, that insincere regret, only stoked the fire in my veins. The anger inside me shifted, growing into something more. A force, a searing wrath that made ordinary rage seem like a flickering match in comparison. It was the kind of feeling that urged you to cross lines you'd never even considered before. And that's when it hit me. I was done playing by their rules, done with pretending everything was fine, done with biting my tongue to keep the peace. If this family was a game of charades, I was ready to set the board on fire. The next day, I sat at my ancient laptop that heated up like an oven, drafting a plan of revenge worthy of a blockbuster. Leo had always been the king of his life, with his business as his crown jewel. His reputation wasn't just praise from our parents and admiring glances from colleagues. It was his shield, his "I'm untouchable." But everyone knows the higher you fly, the harder you fall. And I was going to make sure his fall was nothing short of catastrophic. What's interesting? Leo's business, this grand facade of success, was as solid as a house of cards in a windstorm. Turns out, my brother's talents didn't stop at flirting with other people's wives. He was also adept at financial trickery that would make even a shady politician jealous. Debts, hidden transactions, fake deals, all cloaked behind the shiny exterior of his company. This is where I called on some old connections, friends who knew how to dig up dirt and weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. "Are you sure you want to go this deep, man?" one of my friends, a finance sleuth, asked, sipping his energy drink. "Oh, I don't just want to," I smirked. "I'm going to create a show that'll make Netflix weep with envy." We got to work, checking documents, making calls, connecting with the right people. It all fell into place. If I played my cards right, there wouldn't be a trace of Leo's pristine reputation left. And soon, I began seeing the first signs of my plan taking effect. Leo's partners started showing concern. Accounts began freezing. Rumors spread like wildfire. He still had no clue it was my doing. But this was just the first step. I was going to take everything he cherished, from his business to his golden boy aura that had shielded him for so long. As the fallout from my plan slowly but surely consumed Leo's life, it felt like watching a slow-motion train wreck. First, minor cracks, then total collapse in an instant. Partners who used to pat him on the back and say, "We're in, buddy," started disappearing like guests at a dull party. "Leo, we're reconsidering our options," one of them said, glancing around nervously, as if the tax police were about to burst in. Leo, with his usual air of confidence, tried to keep his composure, but a nervous smile started to betray him. Then things got worse. His bank accounts were frozen so abruptly, it was as if someone hit the pause button on his financial game. He paced his office like a caged animal, trying to figure out who and how had sabotaged him. And me? I sat at home with a cup of coffee, watching the drama unfold through friends' updates and the rapidly spreading rumors. Our parents, Leo's eternal advocates, of course, tried to support him. "It's just temporary trouble," Mom insisted, but her voice wavered. Dad stood next to her, grim-faced, as if weighing whether to spend their last savings to bail out their beloved son or pretend his phone had suddenly stopped working. But the moment of truth came when his shady dealings and debts came to light. It was a blow they couldn't recover from. Their golden boy turned out to be just as fraudulent as his business deals. The parental support faded like smoke in the wind. Leo lost everything. The business he'd been so proud of, the possessions he bragged about at every family dinner, and the status he'd guarded fiercely. But that wasn't the end. Sophie, seeing his downfall and all the dirt that had been unearthed, filed for divorce. She looked hollow, like someone who'd just survived a hurricane. And me? I'd accomplished what I set out to do. Leo, the king of life, stood on the ruins of his castle, and it was a sight worth fighting for. But you know what? Victory tasted a little empty. After all the chaos, I sat alone in my empty apartment, a symbol of my new reality. The silence was so loud I could swear I heard my own thoughts. "Well, Mark, you did it. The grand show is over. The curtain has fallen. No applause." Sophie had packed her things and left without a word. She sought peace far away from the drama, a place where she could heal and not face the wreckage we'd left behind. Leo? He vanished as quickly as if his downfall was part of a magician's disappearing act. Only, there was no magic, just shattered pride and a trampled reputation. His golden glow wasn't just dimmed, it was scorched beyond recognition. And our parents, well, they had to face the harsh truth. Their favorite son, their perfect Leo, was a con man with delusions of grandeur. They tried to reconnect with me, their suddenly rediscovered son, but honestly, it was too late. "Oh, now you remember you have a second son?" I thought, as I saw their tentative texts and accidental run-ins at the grocery store. It's funny how people come to their senses when there's nothing left to save. I looked at the wreckage of our family, a mess of burned bridges and unsaid words, and felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Cold, sharp, like a winter wind. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice for all the years I'd been in the shadow, for every snide remark, every overlooked effort, For every time I was made to feel second best in my own life. And there I stood, in the middle of my personal apocalypse, thinking, well, Mark, looks like you got what you wanted. Now what?